Lily Thompson was a model of suburban perfection. She lived in a picturesque home in Silver Creek, a quiet neighborhood where lawns were always trimmed and families spent their weekends at barbecues or at the local park. Her husband, Thomas, was a well-respected attorney, and they had two beautiful children, aged 7 and 9. On the surface, their lives were the embodiment of the American dream, but behind closed doors, things were not as they seemed. Thomas's demanding job meant he was rarely home. When he was often distracted, glued to his phone or buried in legal documents. The spark that had once defined their marriage had long since fizzled out, leaving Lily feeling lonely and unappreciated. Her days blurred into one another, each filled with the same mundane tasks: school drop-offs, grocery shopping, and keeping the house in perfect order. She loved her children, but they couldn't fill the void left by her emotionally absent husband. It was during one of those long, monotonous days that Lily met Alan Rodriguez. The Rodriguez family had moved in next door just a few months earlier. They were new to the area, having relocated from the city in search of a quieter, more peaceful life. Alan was their only child, a strikingly handsome 18-year-old with dark eyes and an easy smile. He had just graduated from high school and was planning to attend college in the fall. Lily had noticed Alan right away. It was hard not to. He had a presence that was impossible to ignore. At first, she dismissed the attraction she felt as nothing more than a fleeting crush, the kind of thing that might happen when you haven't felt truly seen by your husband in years. But as time went on, her thoughts kept drifting back to Alan. She found herself looking forward to the moments when their paths would cross, whether it was while she was watering the garden or taking out the trash. The first real conversation between them happened on a hot July afternoon. Lily was struggling to carry a heavy bag of mulch to her backyard when Alan appeared out of nowhere, offering to help. She accepted gratefully, and they spent the next hour talking as they worked. Alan was charming and attentive, asking her questions about her life, her interests, and even her dreams. He listened in a way that Thomas hadn't in years. As they finished up, Alan casually suggested that they should get together sometime to discuss landscaping ideas. Lily agreed, not thinking much of it at the time, but that simple suggestion became the start of something much more dangerous. Over the next few weeks, Alan began to visit more often. At first it was innocent enough, discussions about gardening, the occasional glass of iced tea on the porch. But there was an unspoken tension between them, a growing attraction that neither could ignore. Lily knew it was wrong. She was nearly twice his age, married, and a mother. But the loneliness she had been living with for so long made her vulnerable, and Alan's attention felt like a lifeline. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon in mid-July. Lily had invited Alan over to help with some yard work, but when the weather turned, they found themselves trapped in her sunroom, watching the rain pour down. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. They stood close, too close, and when their eyes met, the attraction that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. Without thinking, Lily leaned in and kissed him. It was a brief, tentative kiss, but it unleashed a flood of emotions that neither of them could control. Alan responded immediately, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss. For Lily, it was a moment of pure, unfiltered passion, something she hadn't felt in years. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely intoxicating. From that moment on, their relationship crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They began a secret affair, meeting whenever they could find a moment alone. Lily knew it was a terrible mistake, but she couldn't stop herself. The affair gave her something she had been missing for so long: attention, excitement, and a sense of being desired. It made her feel alive again. But with each stolen moment, the risks grew higher. They were careful, or so they thought. But in a close-knit community like Silver Creek, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The neighbors began to notice Alan's frequent visits, and whispers started to circulate. Lily dismissed the gossip, telling herself that no one would ever suspect the truth. After all, she was the perfect wife and mother. Who would believe that she was having an affair with the boy next door? Yet, as careful as they were, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with fire. Thomas had always been an observant man, and lately, he had started to notice small changes in Lily's behavior. The way she would rush to answer her phone, the late-night texts she tried to hide, the distant look in her eyes. He hadn't confronted her yet, but Lily could sense his growing suspicion. Despite the mounting pressure, Lily and Alan continued their affair. They were drawn to each other like magnets, unable to resist the pull. But as summer turned into fall and the leaves began to change, Lily's perfect world started to unravel. The guilt was eating away at her, and the fear of being caught loomed larger with each passing day. She told herself that she could end it whenever she wanted, that she was still in control. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And when the truth finally came out, the consequences would be far more devastating than she could ever imagine. The affair between Lily and Alan grew more intense with each passing day. What had begun as stolen kisses in the garden and fleeting touches in the hallways quickly escalated into something much more consuming. Every moment they were apart seemed to stretch endlessly, and every stolen second together only fueled their hunger for more. The excitement was palpable, the danger of getting caught only heightening their desire. Lily's life had become a carefully balanced act of deception. Every glance she exchanged with Alan was laden with meaning, every whispered conversation a secret shared between the two of them. But outside their bubble of passion, her world was slowly unraveling. The pressure of living a double life weighed heavily on her, and she was constantly on edge, terrified that someone might find out. Her relationship with Thomas had grown even more distant. He was busy, as always, with his work at the law firm, but there was an underlying tension between them that hadn't been there before. Thomas hadn't yet confronted her, but Lily knew he was growing suspicious. His once occasional glances of curiosity had turned into longer, more searching looks. She could feel his eyes on her, as if he was trying to read her mind, to uncover what was really going on beneath the surface. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas sat down beside her on the couch, his face unusually serious. "Lily," he began, his voice measured, "we need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she was certain that he knew. That somehow, despite all the precautions she and Alan had taken, Thomas had found out about their affair. She felt the blood drain from her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the couch cushion. "What's going on with you?" Thomas asked, his eyes narrowing as he studied her reaction. "You've been distant lately. You're not yourself." Lily scrambled for an excuse, forcing a smile that she hoped didn't look as fake as it felt. "I'm just tired," she lied. "The kids, the house. It's been a lot lately. I didn't realize I was coming across that way." Thomas didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue further. Instead, he gave her a long, searching look before standing up and heading to his office, leaving her sitting in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. She exhaled slowly, relieved that the conversation hadn't gone where she feared it would. But the encounter left her shaken. Thomas was no fool, and Lily knew it was only a matter of time before he began asking more questions, questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Despite her fears, Lily couldn't bring herself to end things with Alan. Every time she tried to pull away, he drew her back in with a smile, a touch, or a whispered promise. Alan was young, impulsive, and reckless in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. He had become more possessive over the past few weeks, pushing her for more time, more attention. He wanted them to be together openly, without the need for secrecy. But for Lily, that was an impossible fantasy. The breaking point came one Friday afternoon when Alan showed up at her house unannounced. Lily had just finished cleaning the kitchen when she heard the doorbell ring. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Thomas wasn't due home for another few hours. She opened the door to find Alan standing on the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "What are you doing here?" Lily whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "I had to see you," Alan said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice was laced with urgency, and Lily could see the fire in his eyes. "You can't just show up like this," she hissed, closing the door behind him. "What if someone sees you? What if Thomas—" Alan cut her off with a kiss, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her close. For a moment, Lily let herself melt into the kiss, the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. But then the reality of the situation hit her, and she pushed him away. "This has to stop," she said, her voice shaking. "We're going to get caught. I can't keep lying to Thomas like this. It's too dangerous." Alan's expression darkened. "What are you saying? You want to end this? After everything?" "I'm saying we need to be more careful," Lily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't some teenage fling, Alan. There are real consequences if we get caught." Alan's face twisted in frustration. "You're just scared!" he snapped. "You're too scared to admit that you want me." Lily took a step back, her heart racing. "This isn't about fear, it's about reality. We can't keep doing this." But Alan wasn't listening. His emotions had taken over, and he was no longer thinking rationally. "I love you, Lily," he said, his voice rising. "I'm not going to let Thomas come between us. We can make this work. We'll figure something out. We'll run away if we have to." Lily stared at him, stunned. "Run away?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alan, that's insane! I have a family! I can't just leave!" "You don't need him," Alan insisted, his voice desperate. "You don't need any of this." Lily shook her head, panic creeping into her chest. She had let things go too far, and now it was spiraling out of control. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "Now!" Alan's face contorted with anger, but after a tense moment he turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Lily stood frozen in place, her mind racing. She had to end this. Whatever they had, it couldn't continue. It was too dangerous, and now Alan was becoming unpredictable. For the rest of the day, Lily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. She felt as though the walls were closing in around her, and the fear of being discovered was suffocating. Alan's words echoed in her mind. "I'm not going to let Thomas come between us." That night, as she lay in bed beside Thomas, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had to find a way out of this mess before it was too late. But deep down, she knew it already was. Alan's love for her had turned into something darker, something possessive and dangerous. And she feared that the worst was yet to come. It was a sweltering August evening when everything began to unravel. The heat clung to the air like a suffocating blanket, and the tension that had been brewing for weeks finally reached its boiling point. Lily Thompson stood at the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her mind racing with the events of the past few days. Alan hadn't contacted her since their last heated exchange, and she had spent every waking moment dreading what might come next. Thomas, as usual, was working late at the office. The kids were playing in their rooms, their laughter echoing faintly through the house. To the outside world, everything seemed normal, another quiet evening in Silver Creek. But inside, Lily's nerves were frayed, stretched to the breaking point. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. And then the doorbell rang. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, staring at the front door as if it were some kind of trap. No one ever visited this late, and Thomas wasn't due home for hours. Slowly, she moved toward the door, her pulse quickening with each step. When she opened it, her worst fears were realized. Alan stood on the porch, his face shadowed in the dim light. There was something different about him tonight, an intensity in his eyes that sent a chill down Lily's spine. He wasn't the boy she had known. There was a wildness to him, a desperation that scared her. "Alan, you shouldn't be here," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous." He stepped inside without a word, closing the door behind him. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Lily instinctively took a step back. There was something wrong, terribly wrong. She could see it in the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around the house as if searching for something. "I couldn't stay away," Alan said, his voice low, almost menacing. "I need to talk to you." "We've said everything we needed to say," Lily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's over, Alan. You need to leave." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, his hands trembling as he stepped closer to her. "It's not over. It's never been over, Lily. I love you." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She had known that Alan's feelings for her had crossed a dangerous line, but she hadn't realized how far gone he really was. "Alan, you need to go. Thomas will be home soon. You can't be here." At the mention of Thomas, Alan's face darkened. He clenched his fists, his breathing quickening. "Thomas," he spat, the name laced with venom. You don't love him, you never loved him, he doesn't deserve you. Lily's pulse quickened. This was spiraling out of control. Alan, please, just leave! We can't do this anymore! Alan's eyes bore into hers, and for a moment she thought he might listen. But then, a dark smile spread across his face. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice low and dangerous. We're meant to be together, Lily. I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. Not Thomas, not anyone. Before she could react, there was a sound behind her, the front door opening, followed by the heavy footsteps of her husband. Thomas had come home early. Lily's heart stopped. She turned to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger as his eyes flickered between his wife and the boy standing far too close to her. What the hell is going on here? Thomas demanded, his voice low but furious. Lily's mind raced. She had no explanation, no excuse for why Alan was standing in their living room at this hour. Her throat went dry as she struggled to find the words, but nothing came. Alan, however, didn't hesitate. She doesn't love you, Thomas, he said coldly. She's with me. She's been with me for months. The words hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. His face drained of color, and for a moment, he looked as though he had been physically struck. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of the children's laughter upstairs. You're lying, Thomas said finally, his voice tight with disbelief. Get out of my house! But Alan didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes locked on Thomas with a predatory intensity. I'm not lying. Ask her. Thomas turned to Lily, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and betrayal. Lily, he said, his voice trembling. Tell me it's not true. But Lily couldn't speak. She couldn't lie anymore. The truth was laid bare before them, and there was no taking it back. Thomas's expression hardened. He took a step toward Alan, fists clenched at his sides. Get out, he repeated, his voice rising. Now. That's when everything went to hell. In a blur of movement, Alan lunged at Thomas, his hand flashing to his back pocket. Before Lily could even register what was happening, Alan pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. There was a moment of stunned silence, a heartbeat of disbelief, and then chaos erupted. Stop! Lily screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of metal slicing through fabric, the sickening thud of bodies colliding. Thomas staggered backward, his hand clutching his side where the knife had pierced his flesh. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt in a dark, spreading pool. Alan stood over him, panting, the knife still in his hand, his face twisted in rage. Lily's world spun as she watched her husband fall to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with shock. Alan, what have you done? Lily's voice trembled with horror. She couldn't comprehend the scene unfolding before her. Thomas, bleeding out on the floor, Alan standing over him like a predator claiming his prey. But Alan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Thomas, his expression unreadable as the blood dripped from the blade in his hand. Lily dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Thomas, stay with me, she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. Please, stay with me. But it was too late. The light in Thomas's eyes was fading, his breaths growing shallower by the second. And as the last bit of life drained from his body, Lily realized with a sickening certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Alan stood motionless, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. His face, once twisted with rage, now contorted with a mix of fear and disbelief. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. For a moment the room was silent, haunted by the weight of what had just occurred. And then, as if waking from a nightmare, Alan took a step back, his breathing ragged and uneven. I didn't mean to, but the words hung in the air, empty and meaningless. There was no undoing what had been done. Lily knelt in the pooling blood of her husband, her hands trembling as she pressed them uselessly against the wound in his side. The warm, sticky blood seeped between her fingers, a grim reminder that everything was slipping away. Her life, her marriage, and her sanity. Thomas's body lay still, his eyes open but vacant, the life drained from him in an instant. She looked up at Alan, who stood frozen in place, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. His hands were still raised, as if holding an invisible weapon, his face pale and haunted by the gravity of what he had just done. The knife lay discarded at his feet, the blood smeared across the floor, a damning testament to his crime. "Alan," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. "What have we done?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring at the blood on his hands as though it belonged to someone else, as though this had all been some terrible dream. But it wasn't. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and there was no waking up from it. "We need to call the police," Lily said, her voice trembling with panic. "We need to—" "No," Alan interrupted, his voice sharp and panicked. He stepped forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. "We can't call the police, Lily. Don't you see? They'll arrest me. They'll arrest us both. I'll go to prison and you'll lose everything." Lily stared at him, her heart racing. He was right. There was no way out of this without consequences, but the alternative, the thought of covering up what they had done, was unthinkable. Yet, as she looked into Alan's wild, desperate eyes, she realized she didn't have a choice. The life they had destroyed lay before them, and there was no turning back now. "We need to get rid of the body," Alan said, his voice urgent, his grip tightening on her shoulders. "We need to make it look like Thomas disappeared. No one can ever know what happened here." Lily's stomach churned. The thought of disposing of her husband's body, of erasing him from existence as though he had never been, was enough to make her sick. But what other option did they have? If they didn't act quickly, the police would start asking questions, and eventually, the truth would come out. "Okay," Lily whispered, barely recognizing the sound of her own voice. "Okay, we'll do it." The next few hours passed in a blur. Lily felt as though she were moving through a nightmare, her actions guided by some force outside of herself. Together, she and Alan dragged Thomas's body to the garage, wrapping him in an old bedsheet, as though that could somehow contain the horror of what they had done. His body was heavy, and every step felt like an eternity as they carried him to the trunk of Alan's car, struggling under the weight of their crime. Once Thomas was loaded into the trunk, they drove to a remote area on the outskirts of town, a place Alan had heard about from some friends, a stretch of woods that no one ever ventured into. The drive was silent, the tension thick between them. Lily's hands shook on the steering wheel as she followed Alan's directions, her mind numb with the enormity of what they were about to do. They buried Thomas in a shallow grave beneath a canopy of trees, the night sky heavy and oppressive above them. Every shovel of dirt that Alan threw on top of the body felt like a nail in the coffin of Lily's old life. When it was done, they stood in silence, staring down at the patch of earth that now concealed their darkest secret. "We can't leave anything behind," Alan said, his voice hollow. He tossed the shovel into the trunk and wiped the sweat from his brow with a shaky hand. "We need to clean up the house, make sure there's no trace of him left." Lily nodded, though she felt disconnected from the words. She couldn't believe this was happening, that she was part of something so horrific, so irreversible. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to move quickly if they were going to pull this off. Back at the house, they worked in grim silence, scrubbing the blood from the floor and walls, disposing of the clothes they had worn, and wiping down every surface that might hold evidence of the crime. Lily's mind raced as she moved mechanically through the house, her thoughts consumed by fear. Could they really get away with this? Could they truly erase every trace of Thomas from their lives? By the time they finished, it was early morning. The house looked immaculate, as though nothing had happened, but the weight of what they had done hung over them like a dark cloud. Lily could still smell the faint metallic scent of blood in the air, and every corner of the house seemed haunted by the ghost of her husband. "We need a story," Alan said, breaking the heavy silence. "We need to make it seem like Thomas just left. Maybe he was stressed out, took off for a while. People need to believe that he's gone, but not gone in a way that will make them suspicious." Lily nodded, though she could barely think straight. The enormity of what they were doing, the depth of their deception, was suffocating. But there was no turning back now. She had to commit to the lie if she wanted to protect herself and Alan. Over the next few days, Lily did her best to play the role of the worried wife. She called Thomas's office, leaving frantic messages about how he hadn't come home and how she was starting to get concerned. She told the neighbors that Thomas had been stressed at work and that he had probably just gone off to clear his head for a few days. It was a plausible enough story, one that most people accepted without question. But the charade was exhausting. Every time the phone rang, every time someone knocked on the door, Lily's heart leaped into her throat, fearing that the police had discovered something, fearing that her carefully constructed lie was about to come crashing down. Alan, too, was on edge. He called her constantly, checking in to make sure everything was going according to plan. His paranoia was growing, and Lily could sense that he was starting to crack under the pressure. The once confident, charming boy she had fallen into an affair with was now a nervous wreck, consumed by the guilt of what they had done. And then, one evening, there was a knock on the door. Lily's stomach twisted in knots as she opened it, finding 2 police officers standing on the porch. Detective Rachel Adams, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator, introduced herself with a polite but firm smile. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your husband," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped aside to let them in. The lie she had been living was about to be tested, and the stakes had never been higher. She knew one wrong word, one small slip, could unravel everything. But as she sat down with the detective and began to spin her web of lies, she realized that the hardest part was still to come. Because no matter how carefully they tried to cover their tracks, the truth had a way of coming to light. And when it did, there would be no escape from the consequences. The days after Thomas's disappearance turned into a blur of fear and paranoia for Lily. Every morning she awoke with the sickening weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest. Every ring of the phone, every knock at the door, sent a wave of dread crashing over her. But the worst part was not knowing how long she could keep the facade going. Alan's frantic calls had become more frequent, and his voice was laced with desperation each time. He was unraveling, and Lily knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Detective Rachel Adams was nothing like the others Lily had spoken to. She was calm, composed, and terrifyingly perceptive. The questions she asked weren't just routine, they dug deep, each one chipping away at Lily's carefully constructed story. Lily had tried her best to act the part of a concerned wife, telling Adams that Thomas had been stressed lately, that maybe he had left to clear his head. But the detective wasn't easily swayed. "So you're saying your husband just walked out? Didn't say a word to you or the children?" Adams asked one afternoon, her eyes narrowing as she studied Lily's face. Lily's hands clenched in her lap as she forced a weak smile. "Yes, he's done that before. He gets overwhelmed with work, but he always comes back." Adams leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the edge of her notepad. "Interesting. And yet, no one at his office has heard from him. His phone records show no activity. Doesn't that seem a little unusual to you, Mrs. Thompson?" The knot in Lily's stomach tightened. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. I don't know. I just assumed he needed time." The detective didn't respond right away, her eyes still fixed on Lily with an intensity that made her skin crawl. After a long, uncomfortable pause, Adams spoke again. "We're going to need access to your husband's phone records, his financials, and any other personal information you have. Just routine, of course. But if anything seems off, we'll have to investigate further." Lily nodded, her mouth dry. "Of course, whatever you need." As soon as the detective left, Lily rushed to the phone and dialed Alan's number. Her hands shook as she held the receiver to her ear, waiting for him to pick up. When he finally answered, his voice was frantic. "They're on to us, Lily, I can feel it." "Calm down," she whispered, glancing around as if the walls themselves were listening. "We just need to stick to the story. They don't have any evidence. We've cleaned everything." Alan was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was full of panic. "I can't do this. I can't live like this, always looking over my shoulder. They're going to figure it out. They're going to find him." Lily closed her eyes, trying to suppress the rising tide of fear. "They won't. We just need to stay calm." But Alan wasn't listening. He muttered something under his breath before hanging up abruptly. Lily stared at the phone, a sinking feeling in her chest. Alan was cracking, and if he broke, their secret would come spilling out with him. The investigation intensified in the following weeks. Detective Adams had a way of showing up unannounced, always with more questions, more doubts. It became clear that she wasn't buying Lily's story. She had been digging into their lives, Thomas's work, Lily's behavior, even Alan's visits to the house. The neighbors had started talking, and gossip was spreading like wildfire. The whispers had reached the police, and now Alan's name was coming up in conversations he couldn't afford to be part of. It wasn't long before Adams brought Alan in for questioning. He had tried to stay composed, but Lily could see the cracks in his facade from a mile away. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure, and he was close to breaking. "I don't know anything," Alan had said when Adams pressed him about his visits to the Thompson house. "I was just helping Lily with some yard work." But Adams wasn't fooled. "Yard work, huh? In the middle of a hot August afternoon? Interesting timing," Alan had stammered. His face flushed with guilt. He was a terrible liar, and Lily knew it was only a matter of time before he slipped up, and that's exactly what happened. A week after Alan's questioning, Detective Adams returned to Lily's house with a search warrant. They combed through every inch of the house, taking samples, checking for traces of blood, fibers, anything that could connect the dots. And when they found what they were looking for, it was over. The forensic team had discovered microscopic traces of blood that had been hastily cleaned from the hardwood floor in the living room. It was enough to raise suspicion, but what really sealed their fate was the discovery of Thomas's phone, hidden away in the garage. Alan had forgotten to destroy it, a careless mistake that proved to be their undoing. Lily was arrested 2 days later. The headlines blared her name, and the story quickly spread through the town, through the entire state. Local housewife and teenage lover arrested in husband's disappearance. The media had a field day with the scandal, turning her once perfect suburban life into a national spectacle. During the interrogation, Lily's composure finally shattered. After hours of relentless questioning, she broke down, confessing to her role in Thomas's death, but insisting that it had been an accident, that Alan had acted in self-defense. But the truth was far messier than that. It was a crime of passion, a tragic consequence of their reckless affair. Alan, too, couldn't withstand the pressure. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the blood, the phone, the witness reports, he crumbled. He admitted to stabbing Thomas in a fit of rage, panicked and blinded by his obsession with Lily. But it didn't matter who had actually held the knife. They were both guilty. The trial was swift and brutal. The prosecution painted them as cold-blooded killers, driven by lust and greed. The defense tried to argue that it was a crime of passion, that Alan had acted impulsively, and that Lily had simply been swept up in the chaos. But the jury wasn't convinced. They saw two people who had planned, executed, and then tried to cover up a murder. Lily was sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role as an accessory to murder. Alan, the one who had wielded the knife, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air. Silver Creek would never be the same. The town that had once been a picture of idyllic suburban life had been shattered by the dark truth of what had happened behind closed doors. Lily's home stood empty, a ghost of the life she once had. The neighbors who had once gossiped about her perfect marriage now whispered about her betrayal, her affair, and the gruesome murder that had rocked their community. In the end, Lily was left with nothing. Her husband was dead, her lover was in prison, and her children had been taken away, sent to live with relatives far from the scandal and horror of what had happened. She spent her days in a cold, gray cell, haunted by the choices she had made, the lies she had told, and the man she had helped kill. As she lay in her bunk each night, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. How had a simple affair led to murder? How had her desire for attention, for excitement, turned into something so dark and twisted? But there were no answers, no way to undo the damage. The consequences of her actions were permanent, and she would live with them for the rest of her life.